July 7, 1968, 2:30 p.m., Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street. The most powerful man in Harlem is lying in a bronze casket, and 2,000 people have come to say goodbye to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. But what nobody expects is that in the next 10 minutes, a quiet man in a cheap suit is going to walk down that center aisle and change the future of organized crime forever. 4 months after Martin Luther King's assassination, Harlem is still smoldering. Literally, you can smell the smoke from the riots, see the boarded-up windows, feel the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. And here, in this sacred space, the funeral of Bumpy Johnson feels like the end of an era. The last king of Harlem is dead. The question burning in every mind is simple: who comes next? In the front rows sit the power players, Italian mobsters from the Genovese family, men in $1,000 suits who've been waiting 11 years for this moment. Behind them, Nicky Barnes and his crew, young, hungry, and convinced the crown belongs to them. Policy bankers, numbers runners, politicians, jazz musicians, and 3 generations of Harlem royalty, all here to witness the burial of a legend. And then, at exactly 2:35 p.m., Frank Lucas walks in. Not impressive, not commanding, just a thin man in a brown suit that probably cost $40, carrying a leather satchel that looks like something a door-to-door salesman might carry. People glance at him, then look away. After all, who is Frank Lucas? Bumpy's driver, the guy who picked up the dry cleaning and made sure the car had gas. But Frank Lucas doesn't take a seat in the back with the other drivers and bodyguards. He doesn't nod respectfully and fade into the crowd. Instead, he starts walking down that center aisle, past the Italian mobsters, past Nicky Barnes, past every person in Harlem who thinks they know how power works. And with each step, the church gets a little quieter, a little more tense, because something is happening that nobody can quite understand yet. He reaches the casket. Bumpy Johnson lies there in his best suit, hands folded, looking peaceful for the first time in 63 years. Frank sets his satchel down on the floor, opens it, and what he pulls out makes every gangster in that church lean forward. Stacks of $100 bills, more money than most people see in a lifetime, more money than anyone expects a driver to have. $100,000 in cash. Frank starts placing the money on Bumpy's chest, stack by stack. 20,000, 40,000, 60,000. The church is dead silent now. Even the babies have stopped crying, because everyone understands they're witnessing something that's never happened before in the history of Harlem. A driver placing a king's ransom on his boss's body. A message so bold, so audacious, that it takes your breath away. When the last stack is in place, Frank Lucas straightens up, looks out over the congregation, and says 8 words that will echo through Harlem for the next 50 years. Harlem belongs to Harlem now. Then he picks up his empty satchel and walks out the same way he came in. Calm, quiet, unremarkable. Except he's not unremarkable anymore. He walked into that church as a driver. He's walking out as something else entirely. A man who just declared himself the new king of Harlem in front of 2,000 witnesses, including every person who thought they had a claim to Bumpy's throne. But here's the question that's haunted crime historians for 55 years. Did it really happen? Did Frank Lucas really put $100,000 in Bumpy Johnson's coffin? Or is this just another legend in a life filled with legends? And if it did happen, where did a driver get that kind of money? To understand that day in the church, you have to understand who Frank Lucas really was. Not the character Denzel Washington played in American Gangster, not the mythology, the real man. Born Frank Lucas Jr. in LaGrange, North Carolina in 1930, came to Harlem in 1946 as a 16-year-old kid with nothing but ambition and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. For 15 years, Frank Lucas was Bumpy Johnson's shadow, driver, bodyguard, confidant, student. While other men saw Bumpy as a gangster, Frank saw him as a professor teaching the most dangerous curriculum in America, how to build and maintain power. And Frank Lucas was a very good student. He learned that respect was more valuable than fear, that preparation was more important than courage, that the best way to beat the system was to understand it better than the people who created it. And most importantly, he learned that in America, everybody has a price. The trick is figuring out what currency they accept. By 1965, Frank wasn't just driving Bumpy around anymore. He was being groomed, handling collections, managing relationships, learning the subtle art of negotiation that kept Harlem from exploding into gang war every other week. And when Bumpy got arrested again in 1967, Frank was one of the few people he trusted to keep things together while he fought the federal charges. But Frank Lucas had bigger ideas than just keeping things together. While Bumpy was focused on the traditional numbers racket, Frank was looking at something else, something that would make the numbers game look like pocket change: heroin. This is where the story gets complicated, because what Frank Lucas claimed he did next sounds impossible. He claimed he cut out the Italian middlemen who controlled heroin distribution, claimed he went straight to the source: Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle, Vietnam. According to Frank, and this is where legend and reality start to blur, he made contact with his cousin who was serving in the military in Vietnam, made a deal to smuggle pure heroin back to America in the coffins of dead American soldiers, called his product Blue Magic, 98% pure, twice as strong as anything the Italians were selling, half the price. Was it true? Could a black man from Harlem really build a pipeline from Southeast Asia to New York City without the Italian mob, the CIA, or military intelligence knowing about it? The logistics seem impossible. The audacity is breathtaking. But here's what we know for certain. By 1968, Frank Lucas had money, serious money, the kind of money that turns drivers into kings. When Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack on July 7, 1968, Frank Lucas was ready. He'd spent 3 years preparing for this moment, building his network, establishing his supply chain, learning which politicians could be bought, which cops could be turned, which rivals could be eliminated or co-opted. So when he walked into that church with a satchel full of money, it wasn't an emotional gesture. It wasn't grief or respect for his fallen mentor. It was a business announcement, a declaration of independence, a way of telling every power broker in Harlem that the old rules were over and Frank Lucas was writing new ones. The $100,000, if it really was $100,000, wasn't just money. It was proof of concept. It was Frank Lucas saying, "Look what I can afford to throw away. Imagine what I can afford to keep." It was psychological warfare at its finest, and it worked. Within 6 months, Frank Lucas controlled more of Harlem's drug trade than anyone since Dutch Schultz. Within 2 years, he was making more money than Bumpy Johnson had ever dreamed of. He bought apartment buildings, legitimate businesses, politicians, and police officers. He created an empire that stretched from Southeast Asia to the streets of New York. But empires built on audacity have a weakness. The same boldness that creates them can destroy them. And Frank Lucas's downfall started with a coat, a chinchilla fur coat that cost $50,000, A coat so expensive, so ostentatious, so perfectly designed to attract attention that it might as well have been made of $100 bills. March 8, 1971, the fight of the century. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden, the most expensive tickets in boxing history. And there, in the best seats in the house, sitting next to celebrities and billionaires, was Frank Lucas, wearing a coat that cost more than most people made in 2 years. The photographs from that night changed everything. Because sitting in the Federal Building downtown, a detective named Richie Roberts was going through surveillance photos from the fight, looking for known criminals and suspicious characters, and he saw something that didn't make sense. A black man he didn't recognize wearing clothes that cost more than a police captain's annual salary. Who was this guy? How did a man who didn't appear in any FBI files afford to sit ringside at the most expensive sporting event in American history? Roberts started digging, and what he found would bring down not just Frank Lucas, but an entire network that had corrupted police departments, military units, and political machines on 2 continents. The irony is perfect. Frank Lucas, who had learned from Bumpy Johnson that the key to power was staying invisible, had made himself the most visible man in America. The student had forgotten the teacher's most important lesson: never let them see how much money you really have. The investigation that started with a $50,000 coat eventually uncovered what prosecutors called the largest narcotics conspiracy in American history. Frank Lucas was arrested in 1975, sentenced to 70 years in federal prison. His empire collapsed overnight. The man who had declared himself king of Harlem discovered that crowns made of cocaine and heroin don't last very long. But what about that day in the church? What about the $100,000? Did Frank Lucas really put a king's ransom in Bumpy Johnson's coffin? The truth is, we may never know for certain. Frank himself told different versions of the story over the years. Sometimes it was 100, sometimes it was 50, sometimes it was just a respectful amount that grew in the telling. What we do know is this: on July 7, 1968, Frank Lucas walked into Abyssinian Baptist Church as one kind of man and walked out as another. Whether he put money in that coffin or not, he accomplished something more valuable. He put an idea in the minds of everyone who mattered in Harlem. The idea that Frank Lucas was not who they thought he was. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Maybe the $100,000 isn't the point. Maybe the point is that in America, perception becomes reality faster than truth becomes legend. Frank Lucas understood what Bumpy Johnson had taught him, that power isn't about what you have, it's about what people believe you have. The story of Frank Lucas putting money in Bumpy Johnson's coffin has been told and retold for 55 years. It's been in movies, books, documentaries, and songs. It's become part of the mythology of Harlem, part of the legend of American crime. And maybe that's what Frank Lucas understood better than anyone else that day in the church. He wasn't just burying his mentor. He wasn't just announcing his succession. He was creating a story that would outlive them all, a story that would make Frank Lucas immortal in ways that money never could. Because here's the truth about power that every king eventually learns. Money can buy you a kingdom, but only stories can make you a legend. Frank Lucas walked into that church with cash, but he walked out with something much more valuable. He walked out with a myth. And in Harlem, in America, in the world of organized crime, myths are the most powerful currency of all. If this story moved you, if you understand that power is about perception as much as reality, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button if you believe that sometimes the legend is more important than the truth. And tell me in the comments, do you think Frank Lucas really put $100,000 in Bumpy Johnson's coffin? Or was the real genius making everyone believe he did? Next week, we're exploring the woman who taught both Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas everything they knew about Rio power. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the Caribbean immigrant who built the numbers game from nothing and proved that the most dangerous weapon in Harlem wasn't a gun, it was a sharp mind and an iron will. Remember, money doesn't make kings, respect makes kings. But sometimes the story of money is enough to make a legend.